Hi, it's Maya here with my October reads and receipts. In October, I took part in 2 readathons, Gothtober and Fortnite Frights. And I will go through what I read in October, how I did with my challenges, my TB account, and I will also haul some books at the end. Timestamps will be in the description as always, and my TB account at the start of the month was 68 books, so let's start with the reads. I've already talked about the first 5 books in my readathon update video, so if you watch that you can maybe skip these ones, but the first book that I finished in October was Susanna Clarke's Piranesi. So this is an owned physical book, it's a pre-order that arrived in October and I read it instantly, and it is a fantasy mystery about Piranesi who lives in the house. And it is this sprawling structure that he writes about in his notebooks. He studies its statues and its tides, and he also helps this one other person who he knows to be alive in the house, who he just calls the other, helps him gather clues for this secret knowledge that the other seeks. But something more is going on, something Piranesi doesn't understand, and that the reader begins to piece together far before the main character does. I took the approach to this that I was reading a novella. It's a short novel and it has quite a big font and big margins. So thinking about this as a novella, I think helped me engage with the ideas more instead of starting to ask for more like I would from a bigger novel. This was atmospheric and immersive, quite dreamlike. Clarke can really write, she's a great storyteller. I can see how with a different author, the same story might have not worked for me, but with Clarke it did. And it's very different from Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but has some sort of similar feeling to it at times of this like big mysterious world behind everything. This didn't fulfill any of the challenges for any of the readathons I did, but if I had done Screamathon, this would have fit perfectly for the challenge to read a mystery with a clueless character. I gave Piranesi 4 stars, and my TBR stays at 68 since this arrived, and I read it instantly. Then another order arrived and I immediately read it, and that one was Caitlin Starling's Yellow Jessamine, and this is a horror novella. For Gothtober, this fulfilled the prompts female protagonist and grey morality. This is a horror story set in this single town that is still holding on. There's a war going on and all the other surrounding areas have this new ruler, but they are still this one city holding on, and it's only a matter of time before they have to surrender. Evelyn Perdanu is the main character. She's a shipping magnate and she's the only person left alive in her family, and she has some secrets. And at the beginning of the book, this strange affliction has arrived at the city at the same time as one of Evelyn's ships, and the afflicted seem to share one thing, the wish to find Evelyn. The first half was very engaging with this dark atmosphere and this sort of oppressive, suffocating setting and the afflicted, but the ending lost me. I found the ending a bit confusing and convoluted, like I got it, but I wasn't a big fan of the way that it was told, if you understand what I mean. I think this storytelling might have been a bit less confusing maybe. I gave this one 3 stars, and again my TBR stays at 68. What is this reading your books the moment that they arrive? I kinda like it. Next I read a library book, and that one was Pet by Akwaeke Emezi, and it is a young adult fantasy. For Gothtober it filled the prompts of a BAME author and LGBTQ+. So this takes place in this city called Lucille, in this utopian future where all monsters have been eradicated. But a creature called Pet emerges from one of Jam's mother's paintings to hunt a monster. I really like the protagonist Jam and her relationship with Pet, who is the creature from the painting. Pet was such a great character with such a unique look, and it was my favorite part of the book. I really like the world building and how this tackles the difficult topics for the young adult audience, like how can people learn to recognize monsters if you tell them that they don't exist anymore. The writing was also very quick to read. I read this in 2 days and I gave it 3.5 stars. Then I read The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell, and this is an owned physical book that I also bought in October, and it is 2 horror short stories, so this fulfilled the challenge for Fortnite Frights to read a short story. I was planning to read, if you watch my TBR, Sheridan Le Fanu's one of his short stories, but I ended up going with this instead. So I really said everything about this in that update video. Basically it has 2 stories. The first one is a Victorian ghost story set in this secluded mansion, and the main character is a nurse who is discovering these past secrets. And the other shorter story is about a group of fairy tale characters gathering into this one party. I gave the first story 4 stars. It was a very fun, like traditional Victorian ghost story, and the second one 3 stars. So I think the whole thing gets 3.5 stars. And again, my TBR stays at 68. Then I finished a manga that is Versailles of the Dead Volume 1 by Kumiko Suekane, which is a horror manga and it's an own physical book, but manga doesn't count for my TBR count. For Fortnite Frights, this fulfilled the challenge Asian author and translated, and for Gothtober, the challenge bones on the cover and red cover. So he's holding a skull there, and I don't know if you can see, but there's also skulls in the pile that he's sitting on. I expected this to be a silly and fun horror manga, and it was, but I was surprised by how much I liked this. So Marie Antoinette is killed on her way to France to marry, and the only survivor of the zombie attack that kills the whole company is Albert, her twin brother, who takes her place. This doesn't explore Albert dressing as Marie Antoinette and taking her place in any great detail, so don't expect this to go and explore gender expression. The leaders of France know that it's Albert. They just go along with the whole Marie Antoinette facade because they don't want to tell Austria that Marie Antoinette died on the way there. So thankfully that means that there's no dread of Albert being found out. So this one has zombies, demons, and a light, dare I say, Helsing vibe at the end. I found this very entertaining. It's totally built on the rule of cool, and I think sometimes I just enjoy that. So I gave this one 4 stars. So now on to books that I haven't talked about before, and the first of those is my NetGalley review copy of Frankie and the Creepy Cute Critters by Caitlin Rose Boyle. And this one is a middle grade fantasy comic. So Frankie is a fairy, she's starting at a new school, but the other kids think that she's creepy because of her looks. You can see that she looks a bit like a bat-like. So we mainly follow along after school as Frankie goes to explore her surroundings to add material to her field guide. On the way, Frankie and the reader learn that scary looking or scary sounding things may actually just be unfamiliar things that you just don't understand yet. So I like that message, and the art style was really cute. One thing that wasn't for me was the very saturated colors. I think they didn't allow for a focal point that well. This one has colors by Boyle herself. I have read one other comic from Boyle before, that one was Jonesy, and that one had different colorists, and I enjoyed that combination more with Boyle's lines. But I think kids would find this very entertaining to read about, like different creatures and their habits, and maybe they would even be motivated to go and start their own field guides. I like things that encourage a spirit of exploration and finding out why things work the way they do and not accepting your first preconceived notions. I gave this one 3.5 stars, but I think you should add a star for an actual middle grade reader. Next, I read an owned ebook, and that was the horror novella Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones. This fulfilled the Fortnite Frights challenge to read a book by an indigenous author. So this one starts when a boy sees his dead father walking through one of the doors of their house. And like Yellow Jessamine, this one was a horror story that I enjoyed more during the first half, but didn't enjoy the last half as much. Although unlike Yellow Jessamine, I think the storytelling was solid the whole way through. Horror endings just depend a lot on the reader. They are very personal, how you feel about them. So for me, I just didn't care for the latter half as much as the first half. In horror stories, I almost always like the journey more than the resolution, maybe because the journey is the more scary part. So this one did have some very good creepy scenes, especially at the first half. Someone said on Twitter that the physical book plays with formatting, but that wasn't in my ebook, so I can't comment. I gave this one 3 stars. Next, I read a Project Gutenberg ebook, and that one was The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, and this is a classic horror novella. For Fortnite Frights, this fulfilled the challenge written before 1960. So this starts when a scientist decides to experiment on a girl, because of course he does, and he wants to let her see to the other side of the veil, so past our world into another dimension, and it doesn't go very well. Like the girl does see there, but it doesn't go very well. So years later we follow characters who come across stories of these women, or maybe just one woman, who have been leading people astray or ruining their lives. This one doesn't really tell you what sort of horror stuff is going on. Like the characters are always like, it's so deprived and horrific, can you imagine? And then it lets you imagine. I read this because I want to read a recent book that plays with this story. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I read an owned physical book, and that is The Angel of the Crows by Catherine Addison. This is a buddy read with Reija. and it is a historical fantasy Sherlock Holmes retelling. For October, this fulfilled the prompt of reading a book that's set in a foreign country to you. So this is set in historical London with supernatural elements like werewolves, vampires, angels, and hellhounds. Mr. Doyle is the main character, the Watson counterpart. Doyle returns from war, finds the Angel Crow, the Sherlock counterpart, and they become roommates and they solve cases. I love the parts about the angel mythos especially, and about the parts focusing on this world and the supernatural creatures, but I found the case retelling sometimes to be boring because I have read all the original Sherlock stories and I knew how things would go and it didn't change a lot, just added a few magical twists. And I also expected more from the one original case that spans the book that wasn't solved by deducing stuff, which was a bummer. But Doyle and Crow together were a great duo. I love the parts with them together. At the end, sadly, there were some cases that didn't allow Doyle and Crow to be at the same place, so that took away something from the end of the book. I would give 4 stars to the parts with them together and with them telling us more about how this world works, but the whole book gets 3.5 stars. Reading this brings my TBR count to 67 books. Next, I read the horror comic Victor Laval's Destroyer by Victor Laval and Dietrich Smith, and colors by Joana Lafuente. This was an owned digital comic and it is a Frankenstein retelling. For Fortnite Frights, this fulfilled the challenges Undead Character, a horror comic, and Black Author, and for Gothtober, the challenges Modern Retelling of a Gothic Classic and Undead Character. Victor Frankenstein's creature makes his return to the modern world after a long seclusion, now as a destroyer who is attacking humanity basically, and a faction of scientists have to react. One of the main characters is Dr. Baker, who is a scientist who is not part of the faction, and she has her own project following Victor Frankenstein's blueprint with modern technology added. So this one is in conversation with current events in the US, like the Black Lives Matter movement. This came out in 2018 and deals with topics like murder by police, and Dr. Baker lost her son in a police shooting, and her family is at the forefront of this comic. I think I would have liked this more as a novella. I've read a novel and a novella from Victor Laval before and very much enjoyed them. So as a novella, I think he would have been able to flesh stuff out more and add better narrative flow that I would have enjoyed more. The panel work in this didn't always work for me, and the story didn't always flow very well. So I wanted a bit more from the characters and from the topics that it dealt with that I think could have been done in a novella. Also, one little side notion, the description on Goodreads doesn't match the content at all, at least the description that I looked at. I give this one 3 stars. And finally, I also read 2 manga from the library that didn't fit any of the readathon prompts. The first one was Blank Canvas Volume 1, My So-Called Artist's Journey by Akiko Higashimura. This is the second volume in the non-fiction manga memoir. I talked about Volume 1 in my September Reads and Receipts, and I talk more about that manga there, so if you're interested, go check that out. But this one focuses on her art school years and how she was struggling with creating art after the huge drive to get in. I gave this one 3 stars. The other manga that I read was Otomen Volume 1 by Aya Kanno. I read this from the library and it is a contemporary comedy manga. So this one tells about a boy who likes traditionally girly things like sewing, cooking, and shoujo manga, but has suppressed that side of him. This boy falls in love with a girl in the same school. There's also this other guy who is weirdly invested in the two's relationship progressing, and there's also this subplot of this manga author. This one was cute. It's from 2009. It occasionally felt a bit dated. I liked the main character, but I really didn't get into the 2 other characters. It was cute, I got the idea, but I probably won't continue. I gave this one 3 stars. Now we're moving on to the receipts. I didn't read a book from my 10 books I want to read in 2020 list. I didn't read a book from my reread challenge. I am still currently reading Dragons of Winter Night. I am almost done with it. I hope to finish this in November. I also didn't fulfill my TBR challenges. So let's move on to the haul. So apart from Piranesi, Yellow Jessamine and The Old Nurse's Story, I also hauled The Hollow Places by T. Kingfisher. This is a horror novel and I am reading this in November. So adding this brings my TBR count back to 68. I also got a couple of ebooks. I got The Toll by Sherry Priest. It was on sale. It's a horror novel and I like the horror novel The Family Plot from Priest before, so I picked that one up. Then I also picked up Babel 17 by Samuel R. Delaney. This is a science fiction classic. I was supposed to read this for a buddy read in a reading group, but I haven't finished it yet. Then I also picked out a Humble bundle which was full of horror manga. So now for the stats. In October I read 12 books, that was 2053 pages. On average I read 66 pages a day and took on average 4 days for a book. I read so many shorter books and comics in October in like 1 or 2 days that if you take out the Angel of the Crows, the average drops to 2 days. And my current physical TBR number is 68 books, so it's still the same as at the start of the year. So in November, I hope to read a book of my TBR for every week of November. So 4 books of my TBR. Let's see how I do. So let me know in the comments if you have read any of these books and how you felt about them. Also feel free to just leave an emoji or a smiley face in these comments just to tell me that you have been here. I've seen other people do this and I think it's fun to see people like just saying hi with a quick emoji. But that's all from me for now and I'll see you in my next video.